President Khoury, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, good evening. I am Leah Sassin, the Communications Manager at the Global Health Institute at the American University of Beirut, and I will be the Master of Ceremony for this event. It's an honor to welcome you all to Wounds of War, the Gaza experience through the eyes of Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta. In partnership with the Institute for Palestine Studies and the Arabic Center for Research and Political Studies, this event will detail what happened and is still happening in Gaza through the eyes of Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta, who was there to bear witness to deliberate dismantlement of the health system in Gaza. To begin, it's a privilege to invite Dr. Fadl Khoury, the president of the American University of Beirut, for a welcoming note. Dr. Khoury's presence here tonight underscores the importance of this event and the critical issues that will be discussed. Dr. Khoury.
Good evening. I'm going to be brief. You didn't come here to see me, or the town halls would have been more full. It's a pleasure to welcome Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta home to a significant degree. He was here for 10 years. He's never been far from AUB. I like the title that Le Monde gave you, The Man Who Fixes Broken Faces. Dr. Abu-Sitta was the founding director of the Conflict Medicine Program back when the Institute for Global Health was in its infancy. It was a small investment from the then Dean of Medicine, Muhammad Saeed, and myself. He's proven to be we knew he was an extraordinary surgeon many years ago, but he's also an extraordinarily human face to the tragedy that's taking place in Gaza. All of us followed him hourly, and then when he disappeared after the bombing of the Baptist Hospital for a few hours, we were worrying, but we're glad he's here with us. And I think everyone here at AUB and in the community is very much looking forward to hearing more of what he can share. He's an individual who makes those of us in the medical profession proud that we've dedicated our lives to it. So on behalf of AUB and the Global Health Institute, welcome home, Ghassan.
Thank you, Dr. Khoury, for your opening remarks. Before I invite Dr. Ghassan for his speech, we will watch together a message from the founding director of the Global Health Institute at the American University of Beirut, Dr. Shadi Saleh. Unfortunately, due to prior commitments, Dr. Saleh is out of the country and unable to be with us in person today.
Hello, everyone. My name is Shadi Saleh, and I am the director of the Global Health Institute at the American University of Beirut. First off, allow me to apologize for not being able to be with you in person and listen to Gassan due to pre-scheduled travel. To start off, all of us know that in medicine there are specialties. We have physicians who specialize in cardiology and oncology and pediatrics and many other specialties. For Gassan, in addition to his clinical specialty as a reconstructive plastic surgeon, Gassan is a doctor in humanity. He has shown us throughout his practice that he is really committed to a cause that is the human cause. That is why it's a pleasure to call him a friend and a colleague. A friend because we have spent so many years together getting acquainted with one another, and I appreciate that friendship. A colleague because some of you know that he was and is the main brain power behind our program in conflict medicine within the Global Health Institute at AUB. As our president, Dr. Fadl Khoury, has said recently, AUB has always chosen action. And a testament of that action is what Ghassan has done and what we as a university and we as an institute continue to do. It will be a pleasure to listen to you today, and I would like to acknowledge the efforts by our co-hosts, the Arab Center for Research and Policy Studies and the Institute of Palestine Studies. We all look forward to listening to what you have to say, and thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Saleh, for your inspiring words. Now, as we transition into the heart of today's discussion, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta, a field-leading plastic surgeon, an award-winning humanitarian, and a distinguished figure in the field of health, renowned for his extensive contributions to medical and humanitarian efforts in conflict zones, including Iraq, Syria, and Yemen. Dr. Abu-Sitta is also the founding director of the Conflict Medicine Program at the Global Health Institute and a member of the Board of Trustees at the Institute for Palestine Studies. Dr. Abu-Sitta has always dedicated his expertise to understanding and addressing the wounds of war, especially as they manifest in the context of Gaza. His insights are not only informative, but carry a weight of responsibility as we strive to comprehend the complexities of health in regions affected by conflict. He dedicated his career to addressing the complex challenges of healthcare delivery in conflict-ridden areas. His work extends beyond academia, as he actively engages in on-the-ground efforts, providing medical assistance and advocating for the rights and well-being of affected populations. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta.
Thank you very much for this kind welcome to be back home at the Institute, where one feels not just amongst very dear friends, but also an institution that I've always felt was intrinsic to what I had always viewed as a journey that has taken the Palestinian people and their concept of health from pre-1948, where amongst the 75 Palestinian doctors, 3/4 were graduates of this institution, to the time when doctors at this institution and medical students went out of the institution to provide the kind of medical care that our people needed in the refugee camps of Lebanon, to the time when students went out to the south and set up clinics and treated the wounded of the war. And so for me, this is the rightful place to be when talking about what is, I think, a very Palestinian experience in terms of our understanding of the relationship between health and the act of liberation, both liberating people and liberating their land. And so thank you very much again for that kind reception. You start on Saturday night. By Saturday night, it was very obvious that what was coming was a horrific war. And really, by the evening, my wife and I had that conversation that we've had in 2021 and 2014 and 2009, and really at every war, which is to watch is a very stilted conversation, because there's more unsaid that is said. And very quickly we kind of agreed that the right thing to do was to be there, as we had always agreed on where I should be. And really, by Sunday morning, my friends at MSF, some of whom are here, had sorted out the tickets, and we had agreed that I would go through Egypt, because that was the quickest part, and try to kind of take advantage of that confusion that happens at the beginning of each war, where you're able to kind of get in unhindered. By Monday morning, the 9th of October, I was in Rafah, making my way to Gaza city. And really, as a result of the bombing that night, we were pinned down in a house. We couldn't move until the Tuesday morning. And it was Tuesday morning that I was able to walk from the house that I was in with my cousins to Shifa, where a journey that I had not expected, that lasted around 43 days, took me through not just Shifa Hospital, then the Hawda Hospital in the north in Jabalia, and then back to Shifa when that was threatened, and then to Al-Ahli Baptist Hospital, and back from Al-Ahli Hospital when the Israelis fired a missile into the hospital, killing over 480 people. And then again, a few weeks later, back to Baptist Hospital when, as an act of resistance, the doctors and the nurses fixed parts of the hospital so that we can operate again. And it was really very quickly that it was apparent that this wasn't the usual war. The sheer ferocity of the attack, the fact that unlike the 2014 war where buildings were being targeted, here you would watch whole neighborhoods disappear, first into a flash and a fireball, and then into a cloud of dust, and then these neighborhoods would completely turn into rubble. And then with the passing days, the sheer number, the astounding number of wounded and those killed really highlighted the fact that this is a war of genocide, rather than a war that aimed at some military objective. And throughout my experience, both here and in other wars in Gaza and in Yemen, in Syria and in Iraq, one had come to learn how to read the war through the wounds of those patients, and how to read the weapons from the forensic evidence of those patients. And very soon after, we started seeing the full range of the kind of destruction and the kind of diabolical application of science that was behind these weapons. First wave where incendiary bombs were being used, and we would receive hundreds of burns, covering over 50-60% of the body surface area. Then another wave where we were seeing whole families disappear, multi-generations. We started seeing children who were the sole survivors of multiple generations of the same family. Then we started seeing colleagues being killed. The first, and I'd like to pay tribute to him, Dr. Midhat Saydam, who was killed when he tried to take his sister back to their house where his siblings were, when the Israelis targeted the house, killing him, all of his siblings and all of their children and his parents. And then you felt that there was an intensity that was performative. The war was being performed in a way that the Israelis wanted you to understand that there is no red lines, and that they would pick those red lines that you believed existed in any kind of war, and then in a very open and exhibitionary way would take them apart. And I think the war and the attack on Al-Ahli Hospital was really that part of that test. That morning, because there were so many patients at Shifa Hospital, well beyond the capacity of the operating rooms, we had decided, myself, my colleagues and I, that I would start taking patients to Al-Ahli Hospital to try to alleviate some of the pressures on Shifa Hospital, that we were sometimes a week behind in taking cases to the operating room at Shifa because the sheer number of the wounded was overwhelming, and the resources were being consumed at a rate where we're starting to run out of things very quickly. And I remember arriving that morning at the Baptist Hospital, where I had worked in 2021, and during the marches of return on the day the American embassy had been moved to Jerusalem, and there were thousands of gunshot wounds of demonstrators. I remember noticing that like Shifa Hospital, the hospital had turned into a internally displaced camp. Al-Ahli Hospital is one of the most beautiful hospitals. It's Gaza's oldest hospital. It was built in the 1880s by initially the Quakers, and then during the First World War it was taken over by the British and was known as the English Hospital. And then eventually, and it was taken over by the World Council of Churches, and the Anglican Church in the UK managed it on behalf of the World Council of Churches. And really, it was that connection with the UK that made everybody think if there was any hospital that would be targeted, Al-Ahli Baptist would not be the one. When I arrived, the place was, because it had well-kept gardens, the place was full of families who just thought this is the safe place to hide. And I remember we started the day working, and by the middle of the day, I realized that I needed to continue operating into the night because the numbers were there and I had to start early in the morning. And so I made the decision to stay that night. And it was in that night, between cases, we had just wheeled the patient out, we were wheeling another one in, when we heard the screeching sound of that missile and then the huge explosion. And the proximity of the explosion, the wave that hit the operating room where the false ceiling fell, made me immediately know that the hospital had been directly hit. And I remember walking out into the courtyard of the hospital, where I had earlier seen these families taking refuge. And the ambulances were on fire, the cars were on fire, and the fire had lit the courtyard, and the courtyard was just littered with bodies and parts of bodies. And it was obvious that what had happened is a direct missile attack exactly where people were sitting. And it hadn't happened, even though in 30 years that spanned from the first Intifada to Yemen and everything in between, I had not been in a hospital that was directly hit, and a situation where the wounded I was in the middle of the wounded as they were wounded. And it was obvious for me, and unfortunately those who've written reports about whose missile it was and had never asked any of the doctors or any of the victims about to provide evidence or a witness report. It was obvious to me that there was something very different about this weapon. The number of amputations, the location of amputations. I would later seeing other injuries and kind of looking at why these injuries were happening, realized that this is a new drone-fired Hellfire missile that was nicknamed the Ninja, because it would fragment, the whole shell would fragment into discs that would cause amputations. And the first patient that I had seen had basically had an amputation at the level of his thigh, that looked like a guillotine. And all around you, there are people with pieces of metal in them, rather than injuries that were consistent with other explosives. Once we started resuscitating some of the patients, I went back to, with the patient, transferred one of the patients who had a shrapnel in his neck and was bleeding through the neck. I took him back to Shifa Hospital. And then the rest of the wounded came, and then by the end of that night, 483 bodies had been counted for. And the wounded had been taken to the operating room or to the intensive care unit. And it was really then that I understood that it was the Ahli being specifically targeted. Initially, that morning when I arrived to Al-Ahli, I was met by the administrators who told us that, despite the fact that they had received warnings from the Israeli army, and 2 warning missiles had been fired at the outside gate of the hospital, they had received assurances from the bishop in the UK that he had been told by the Foreign Office in the UK that it was safe. But it was obvious that the selection of the hospital was a litmus test. the Israelis wanted to test the resolve of the world to see whether this high-profile hospital, if it's been attacked, what would be the response. And unfortunately, as you all know, the response was so miserable that the Israelis got the answer that they were looking for, and within days, they set about really dismantling the health system in the north. By the end of that week, they had attacked 4 children's hospitals and taken them apart. And then they set about putting forward the whole narrative about Shifa Hospital being this headquarters with underground facilities. And while putting forward this narrative, would just literally dismantled one hospital after another, taking them out of the system. Until that fateful day, I remember that when there was a big press conference by the Israeli army about the diagrams and the tunnels, and it was apparent that the Israelis were going to come for Shifa Hospital. That night, the Israelis intentionally cut off all of the communication. 2 hours after the press conference, cut off all communication with Gaza, internet and mobile phones and landlines, and then set about shelling the buildings surrounding the hospital, and then shelling beach camp, which is on the coastal road, from the artillery that was on the east border of Gaza. And that night, when you kind of saw the missiles land around you and overhead, you kind of understood that really this is the main military strategy of the war, was to dismantle the health system. And that the aim of this dismantlement, alongside the taking apart of all of the components of modern life, water desalination plants, sewage, bakeries, attacking well-known warehouses for some of the pharmaceutical companies. The idea was to, what we call, create a self-feeding catastrophe. You create the catastrophe, and then that catastrophe continues on without needing to be fed. The wounded will have no place to be treated. With the destruction of the water and sewage treatment system, you will have the epidemics that you need. And by taking out the bakeries and preventing more food getting into Gaza, you will have the malnutrition that you require to create that perfect combination of malnutrition, injury, and overcrowding and unsanitary life, so that epidemics can start taking their toll on people. And it was really at that kind of point, and it was that night, that we started seeing this other wave of performative death. The Israelis started firing phosphorus bombs over Al-Shati camp, and we started getting people with phosphorus bombs. I'd treated people with phosphorus bombs during the 2009 war, and they have a very distinctive injury pattern. They're unlike thermal injuries, the burn from the outside in. As chemical burns, they burr their way into the body, and you have these deep burns that extend all the way into the bone or into the internal organs. And really, it was yet another kind of exhibition of violence. And violence for the Israelis is useless if it's not performative. It has to be seen to be violent. Unfortunately, soon after, the situation kept getting worse at Shifa Hospital, and I was forced to again start considering the idea that we needed to start taking patients again to Al-Ahli. Our colleagues at Al-Ahli Hospital had managed to fix a couple of the ground floor wards. The top floor wards were damaged, and the shaft of the elevator was damaged, and so we couldn't fill out and they had fixed the 2 of the operating rooms. And again, I started taking patients from Shifa Hospital back to Al-Ahli Hospital on a daily basis, operate on them, and then go back that evening to Shifa. until one of those mornings, the Israelis completely encircled Shifa Hospital, and I was on the other side at Al-Ahli. That day, Al-Ahli Hospital became the last remaining hospital in Gaza city, and we started receiving the wounded. Hospital that had 30 beds and 2 operating rooms within days had over 500 wounded, many of whom were on mattresses in the hospital grounds. And our capacity to treat them was so infinitesimally small that only the most immediately life-threatening cases could go. Everyone else was bandaged and placed on the mattresses. And the siege started to bite. We ran out of morphine, we ran out of ketamine, which is a veterinary anesthetic that we use in war surgery because it allows us to perform complex procedures without the need for anesthesia, for an anesthetist. And so soon these wounded patients who had been just bandaged up were showing signs of infection of these wounds. And we were forced to perform really painful procedures to clean these wounds with no anesthetic, and sometimes on children, because the risk of infection was becoming so high that their lives were at risk. Things were so, at that time, so basic that we were doing these cleanups with washing up liquid and vinegar and boiled water. We would boil to sterilize and then use it because we didn't want to finish the saline bags that we had. And we continued on really with that, just trying to do the best. Towards the end, there was no reconstructive surgery. I was assisting my colleagues in doing abdominal surgery. I was doing airway procedures. And it was just very basic war surgery. The last 2 days, the Israelis targeted a mosque where a well-known family in that neighborhood used as a shelter and as a mosque, and they picked the kind of Isha prayers. They fired the missile. It was yet another one of those Hellfire missiles, and we received that night 60 killed and several hundred wounded. And it was really that night that we had to triage people with the help of their relatives. They would decide which one of the wounded they felt that needed to go to the operating room, because everybody needed to go to the operating room. And it was based on how many children they had, who they were raising. We operated that night till 5 o'clock in the morning. And then at 5 o'clock in the morning, at the end of the last procedure, the anesthetist told us that they'd run out of medication, run out of anesthetic, propofol, ketamine, everything had finished. And it was really at that moment that we decided that, as a surgical team, there was nothing left for us to do in northern Gaza. And we made our way. In the early hours of the morning, we decided to walk out of the hospital. Now, the problem was that we had seen and heard what were called quadcopter drones. These are small drones with a sniper gun. And we had received from the vicinity of the hospital over the previous days over 20 patients who had been shot with high-velocity gunshot wounds by quadcopters as they tried to get to the hospital. We kind of followed the side streets out of the hospital in what took 6 hours to get to what the Israelis had referred to as the pathway between the north and the south, and that was supposed to be a safe zone. When we got it to Salah ad-Din Street, it was like a scene from... It really was, for me, Naji Al-Ali had described what the Israelis had done in Sayda in 82, when they brought all of the inhabitants of Sayda and all of the inhabitants of Ain al-Hilwa to the beach. And it was very much like that. You had to walk through a very narrow area and look to the left And rather than what had happened in 82 before the technology, there was a masked man with a bag on his head who had pointed people out. To the left were cameras and binoculars, obviously with facial recognition software. And people would be stopped and you would be asked to put your hand on the guy next to you. And if it's the right guy, then he would be told to leave the child that he has and walk towards the Israeli soldiers. And you could see that there are people who'd been arrested, stripped down and blindfolded and arrested. And along that road, they had intentionally left dead bodies so that you can see what was happening as you walked past them. I eventually got to the other side, to Nusayrat camp, which is in the central area, but what was designated now the south. And I joined some friends in a hospital that was being run by a Palestinian NGO in Nusayrat. And for those remaining 2 days, I was just doing dressing changes because I discovered that the situation in the south was not much better. The operating rooms were so short of resources, so short of fuel, that as a surgeon, you had the same sense of paralysis because you couldn't get your patients to the operating room. There was, only the most critically ill were getting there, and it very limited. And it was really at that time that I thought, this is the time to properly leave. On the morning where I was supposed to leave, I had operated at Al-Ahli hospital on a child, a 13-year-old boy, who had his mother was killed and his siblings were killed, and it was just him and his dad, and he had an amputation to his right thigh and a crush injury to his hand, and I had to do a surgical procedure that was from the 50s, literally described in kind of early plastic surgery books, where you bury the hand in the wall of the abdomen so you can protect the exposed tissues. And when I left Al-Ahli hospital, I went and spoke to the dad and told him where I was heading. And that morning when I was supposed to leave in Nusayrat, they came to the hospital. His dad has pushed him for those 6 hours in a wheelchair to come and see me. And it was probably the most difficult decision that I would have to make. That after I cleaned his wounds, that I would still leave. And with him, lots of my patients. The killing continues as we speak now. The genocidal intent is still there. This is Benny Morris's war. Benny Morris is the Zionist historian who, having written one book about the genesis of the Palestinian refugee crisis, where he described the massacres in 48, had a change of heart and then did a series of articles with Ha'arts where he said this was the biggest mistake the Zionist movement made. They left the Palestinians in the Galilee, in the West Bank and the Gaza, and unless the Zionist movement corrected this mistake, then it was doomed as a project to fail. And from very early on, we realized that this was the aim of this war, is really to continue as a first step before they moved on to the West Bank and the Galilee and the Arab Triangle, to clear the country of the remnants of who they had left behind in 48. And the aim of this catastrophe that they're creating, so that it would continue on after this war has ended, is to clear the country so that they can move on to the West Bank and to the Galilee. And really, that is the mentality that exists now amongst the Israeli public, amongst all sectors of Israeli public. There was, during the war, a petition signed by 400 leading Israeli doctors calling for the destruction of the Palestinian health system, calling on the army to target the Palestinian health system. And so when you reach that final solution mentality, it is bleak what is held for us. But at the same time, it's these acts, not just of resistance as we know it, these daily acts of resistance by the fact that their Jabalia camp in the north is still full of people, that there are still almost 700 to 800,000 living in northern Gaza, that people now share everything openly with each other, that there are houses where they've put up people they barely knew to live with them, where these acts of love that you can never understand in normal conditions, where people adopt the children who are now wounded but have no remaining relatives and help and feed them with their own children. All of these acts of collective solidarity and love in the face of what is just the palpable hatred of settler colonialism towards natives is what keeps people moving. But even they have a finite ability to stay steadfast. Over 50,000 wounded, majority of whom have not had their wounds fully treated. Israel has killed 1% of Gaza's children. Between those who have been registered, around 7,000, to those who are believed to still be under the rubble and buried in their homes, 1% of Gaza's children have now been killed in under 50 days. And the continuation of this genocide, and it's the magnitude of it is what everybody finds difficult to kind of just wrap around. Imagine that this day and age it can happen, but it is happening, and that's why we need to find answers to stop this, because once it starts, then it'll move to the West Bank, and it'll move to the Galilee, and then it'll move to Lebanon. This war says a lot about where the Zionist movement is historically than about us. And that is what needs to be taken as a lesson from the war in Gaza. They are now in a genocidal frame of mind, and that will never be quenched, as we can see in Gaza. Thank you very much.
We express our deep appreciation to Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta for providing invaluable perspectives on the challenges faced in conflict zones and the enduring impact on communities. Now, we will explore together the intricate interplay between conflict, health, and human resilience through a moderated discussion. The moderator, Dr. Muna Khalidi, is a health and social development expert with a particular focus on Palestinian community. She's also involved in research and production of documentary films on social justice issues. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Muna Khalidi to facilitate this engaging conversation with Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta.
Okay, good. Thank you, Ghassan. So good evening, everyone. I will start with a few words that I want to say, which is that we heard a lot about Ghassan, but I still want to talk a little bit about Ghassan, the person. For one thing, Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta is a rare breed. He's the rare breed of physician who was able to put both in theory and practice, bridge the gap between highly specialized medicine and public health. He is a surgeon who sees, but more importantly, appreciates the bigger picture. And he does that by clearly understanding and responding to the needs of his patients at both the micro level and at the level of the wider community at one and the same time. Dr. Ghassan Abu-Sitta, I think, has clearly shown us through his career that he acts on his sense of duty, on his belief system, and on his ethics and moral principles. He is not only a surgeon and a public health person, but he is also very aware of the importance of documenting what is going on, of being a witness, and of what the young generation calls speaking truth to power. And this is what he's doing now since he left Gaza this last time. Just anecdotally, today I walked with Ghassan through the AUB campus, a walk that I've done a billion times in my life. But this time it was different because at every 3 steps somebody would stop us, whether it's a colleague or a student or one of the cleaning staff or one of the security men, and they would stop him and thank him for being an inspiration. As we left College Hall, we found waiting for him a young student who had heard that he was there holding a bouquet of flowers and lots of tears. And she just wanted to thank him for being her inspiration and for being a hero. And I think she speaks certainly on my behalf, but I think on behalf of all of us. So thank you, Ghassan.
Yeah, actually.
And now that we've sufficiently embarrassed you, I'd like to pick up on some of the things that you spoke about. So one of the things that you said was, this war is different. This is your 5th Gaza war. And you said this is different. And it's not different only in terms of scale. I would like you to speak a bit more about that. But one of the interesting things about it, is that it's a multi-epidemic situation. So we have an epidemic of wounded, we have an epidemic of communicable diseases, we have an epidemic of malnutrition that's taking place now, we have an epidemic of non-communicable diseases as services break down, we even have an epidemic of cancers as they've targeted specific services. Can you tell us a little bit more about why it's different in addition to the scale?
In terms of the scale, it really is the difference between a flood and a tsunami. Just everything about it was much bigger, and because the intent was different. This was a genocidal war rather than a military victory war. And so the aim of it was never, and it never is, to gain the upper hand in any way. The aim of it is to make the place uninhabitable. And you make the place uninhabitable by killing as many people and wounding as many people, and then making sure that those who are left behind, their lives are so miserable that they will have to leave soon after. And that's, since I've left Gaza, that's the point that I've always been trying, is that the war is going to continue after the ceasefire. That the real war is going to start when they deny the rebuilding, they deny the medical teams access to the 50,000 wounded, when they deny the universities an ability to rebuild, stop people from getting their kids into education because all of the schools are full of refugees. All of these things are really being put in place now so that whatever is left carries on well after the war. In terms of scale, one of the meetings that we had a few days ago, I went to Qatar because the Children's Prosthetic Center in Gaza is funded by Doha Foundation, Qatar Foundation. And prior to the war at GHI, we were starting a project with them looking at the burden of care of pediatric amputations. And at that time, there were still 180, 190 children with war-related amputations in Gaza. In this war, and this is really a conservative estimate, I think there's probably now between 900 and 1,500 children with amputations in this war, many of whom now have multiple amputations, and many of whom have been left without family to look for them. to look after them. And so, and that's a kind of example of the, so not only is the dimension of wounding much more difficult, the complexity of the wounding, the social component, looking after these kids is going to be much more difficult. The mental health burden on these children is much more difficult. And this is only a small cohort in multitude of, when Shifa collapsed, there were 120 children who were wounded and were the sole survivors of their families. And they had no one left, even a kind of second cousin to look after them. Some of whom were so young, we didn't know their names. And they did, they were less than 3, we couldn't ask them their names. So all of these layers of kind of wounding, not just the physical, but the social and the psychological, are happening at a scale, as Muna said, that is an epidemic scale. How do you address mental health needs of 2.5 million people? What is the post-traumatic in a place that doesn't know what post-trauma is? How do you start mental health support when people are still wounded and they're still living in shelters and they're still struggling to find food? All of these complexities that we've never seen in this modern day, but probably had existed in the past in other genocidal campaigns. We're having to witness and come up with solutions and think about the day after. What do we do for the people who are left behind so that the wounds are allowed to heal and that this ethnic cleansing, which is the aim of this war, doesn't happen?
I just want to pick up on one thing before I ask you about the future. When you're talking about the burden, the people we traditionally rely on, the carers, whether they're medical staff or the teachers or psychiatrists or psychologists, they themselves are the victims of what's going on. So how do we expect those people to then pick up the pieces and care for others?
Till now, there's around 290 doctors and nurses and paramedics who've been killed. And they've not been randomly killed. The percentage of doctors who've been killed who have unique skills is too high for us to believe. When the only nephrologist in Gaza, after 6 years of residency in Jordan, gets killed during the war, when the only, and he was a colleague of ours at GHI and was a fellow at the Global Health Institute doing research in Gaza, the only pathologist in the cancer hospital is killed. When the head of neurosurgery is wounded because his house is targeted. You see that this dismantlement of the health system is not restricted just to the buildings and the equipment. There is an attempt to make sure that this is truly an uninhabitable place when this war ends. Within the small group that I was in, and it was probably one of the smallest departments, there were 7 of us. All of my colleagues had lost their homes. Dr. Midhat Saydam was killed. Another young doctor, his brother, who was 18 and had high school diploma later on this year, was initially wounded with shrapnel in the head and then passed away. We had a colleague who, while in the emergency department, his cousins were brought in half dead and the others were badly injured. Everyone in that team was directly affected because the percentage of those killed, 1 in 200 people, meant that everybody was being affected. And that was then. So the percentage now is probably closer to 1.5. 1.5% of the population and 1% of the children are now been killed in just 50 days.
Which brings us to the real war, as you said, which is what comes next, making Gaza uninhabitable. So the tools we have will not work currently. how do you see this going? How do you see, I know you've spent a lot of time talking to various forums about this. I know you have your own recommendations of how to handle this on the today level, on the immediate level, on the short-term level, medium-term and long-term. Can you walk us through some of the ideas that you have?
So the most important thing is for us not to accept this as a fait accompli, that this is the fate of the Palestinian people and that the Israelis will do what the Israelis will do, and the world needs to walk around the catastrophe. And to ensure that those governments, both within the region and outside, are held accountable for their role in maintaining the siege on Gaza. In terms of the practicalities, when you look at the 45 to 50,000 wounded, around 20,000 children wounded, these are multiple stages. They will need intensive support, mental health support, while they're going through these stages. And the aim of this wounding is so that when they are eventually taken out for treatment, even if they go out with one accompanying relative, then they become, they help clear the way. And so we need to have, unfortunately the size means that all of the solutions need to be, we need to have teams going in with field hospitals to increase the capacity. We need to have some of the more critically wounded and the complex injuries taken out. We need to rehabilitate the damaged hospitals so that they can, as quickly as possible, get back on line so that they can increase the capacity of treatment. We need to rebuild the non-communicable diseases, the cancer centers, the ophthalmology, so that people don't continue to die from their chronic diseases. And we need to train and give people, a reason to stay. Or we need to help them stay. I mean, one of the things that, and this is what one thinks that one was sufficiently politically aware to kind of not be surprised by anything. But one of the things that I think really surprised me about this war is that the humiliation of becoming a refugee, that degradation that happens to the soul of becoming a refugee, was such a formative part of Palestinian modern identity that it is a fate for Palestinians worse than death. And that's why Jabalia camp is still full of people. And that's why when the Rafah border was opened, those stuck outside Gaza went in rather than a stampede to the outside. The Israelis thought that the death and the threat of further death would drive people out, but they had failed to understand that in the Palestinian collective memory, there is a fate worse than death. And that is to become a refugee, destitute, dependent on others, loss of social status, loss of community connections. And that is what keeps people there. They will not go through what their parents and grandparents went through again, even if they have to die where they are.
So no second Nakba.
Absolutely. And it's a recognition that this is a Nakba part 2. This is the continuation of Nakba, and that people will not leave. Now, what the Israelis believe they're able to do is make the situation so bad that people leave for their kids. People leave for their children's education. That's why over 300 schools have been destroyed. That's why there was a night where they just carpet bombed the universities. That's why they killed several of the deans and the president of the University of the Islamic University, who's a well-known physicist, highly cited. There's a method to this madness, and the method is and that it is that we need to fight against. At the moment, we are so restricted in what we can do, but what we can do as communities in the region is start thinking about what do we do in the day after? How do we help people stay? And we help them stay by ensuring that whatever we learned from COVID is extended to them so that their kids can get an education. Whatever teams can be brought in. Whatever we can do to bring the wounded out, we can do that. All of these things, all of these components that help people remain steadfast are activated by communities across the region.
I remember you telling me that the first time you went out from Shifa, that the night before 3 universities had been pretty much obliterated, like razed to the ground. That was shocking, because that's not the kind of news one hears regularly. I want to ask you a small question that people ask a lot, which is about the idea that the Israelis test new weapons. You mentioned the armadillo. You mentioned the sniper drones. These are causing a lot of damage. And it has been mentioned that they're actually experimenting, and one of the reasons that there are mass graves that sometimes are raided is precisely because they want to continue to study the effect of their weapons so as to be able to document it and then sell it better. Can you speak a bit about that?
So if you look at the history of phosphorus bombs, so phosphorus bombs were first reported by the hospitals in Sur and Saida in '82. And they reported that the problem that they were having was that when they put the bodies inside the morgue, the phosphorus fumes were still coming out. And so you realize that actually from that point, there is an R&D plan for these that has taken us from that war to 2009 to this current war, where they have been perfecting phosphorus burns and phosphorus bombs. And what happens is there's an upshot in sales of these weapons right after each Israeli war on Gaza. I'm sure that the quadcopter sniper is going to the sales are going to go through the roof. This Hellfire missile, that's a fragmentary missile, the sales are going to go through the roof. There's a kind of interesting, someone was talking about the difference between South Africa and Israel. And they were saying that in South Africa, the South African Pretoria regime needed black labor to generate wealth by going down the mines and extracting capital value. The Israelis, because they do not need Palestinian labor, extract value from the Palestinian body by creating a whole industry that is around the wounding and the murder and the surveillance of Palestinians. And so it almost becomes that the Palestinian body is the mine rather than the miner, where Israeli capital creates value.
Okay. I know you were instrumental in developing the GHI program, conflict medicine program, the curriculum. After this war, is there anything you would add to that program?
This was a course that we had written, and with the aim of having it as a part of the curriculum of medical schools, and we at GHI managed to get Adan University, Al-Mustansiriya in northern Iraq, and the Islamic University in Gaza to run the course for their students. And after this experience, for me, what I would add is this, what I had learned about inventing new things, about using vinegar and washing up liquid, about spending the night cutting up cardboard boxes where the supplies had come in and turning it into splints so that the following day we can use them as splints for the fractured patients because we'd run out of plaster of Paris, about re-sterilizing one single-use equipment, having been so used to just disposable one-use equipment in this day and age. And I would add about those skills that by virtue of being part of a previous generation of surgeons, where you had to become a general surgeon before you subspecialized, whereas now you're expected to subspecialize after medical school, that there are certain skills within the armamentarium of every surgeon, whatever specialty, you need to do. You need to be able to, I mean, the number of, when these bombs went off, these fragmentary bombs, a lot of them would go into the trachea and the airways of people, and the number of cases where I had to open someone's airway and put a tube so that they can breathe, the number of cases that I was doing, there are so many things that you still need as a surgeon before you become a plastic surgeon or an orthopedic surgeon, that you need to always remember, because you live in a part of the world where this disease is endemic. And unless we understand the endemic nature of this disease, we will continue to kind of face the consequences.
Basically talking about being prepared, being innovative and being unstoppable, like overcoming obstacles as they put them in your course, as they will.
I think that if you have a deep understanding of the pathology, and that's why we were advocating at GHI that this belongs in the undergraduate curriculum, then you can be innovative, because you're grounded in the knowledge and in the fundamentals of this kind of medicine. I'm not saying that we kind of look forward to having, but just having an understanding of it means that you're able to understand what needs to be, the innovations that you need to be making at every stop.
Okay, I think we're coming to the end of our time. I just have one last question for you. Talking to you brings home all the magnitude of the crisis, the disaster that we're facing, and yet you have hope. What do you build that hope on?
From a human level, my hope is in this miracle in which, despite everything, there are still people there who are persisting, and they are resisting in those day-to-day acts of existence. That they have, that they have stayed in Jabalia, that they have stayed in Beit Lahiya, that there's still hope because of my colleagues who are just, you are amazed that, those who were imprisoned in Shifa Hospital for over 2 weeks, when they were released, they went and joined the next hospital down the road, or went to the south and joined another hospital. That from the very beginning there was an implicit national decision taken by all health staff that regardless of how many times they target the hospitals, that the hospitals will not evacuate as long as there are patients. And so these acts of kind of steadfastness by ordinary people doing ordinary acts of living in the face of this death world that the Israelis have created is what fills you with hope. And what fills you with hope is that after 75 years that the Israelis have reverted to this level of barbarism because they cannot understand why, after everything, we're still there.
Thank you, Ghassan.